Every man in Coulter County knew that if Seth Graves sat down across the table from you, you were already halfway to losing everything you owned. The year was 1874, deep in the sun-scorched heart of Texas, and the town of Redrock sat stubborn as a blister on the edge of the Llano Estacado. It was the kind of town that had grown up not because the land was kind, but because men too proud or too desperate to move elsewhere had planted their boots into the caliche and refused to be budged. There was a church with a crooked steeple, a livery that smelled of horse sweat and hay, 3 saloons that did more business than the church ever dreamed of, a general store, a land registry, and a jailhouse that had seen more occupants than the hotel. It was a town stitched together from ambition and stubbornness, and it suited Seth Graves perfectly. Seth was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders the way a man gets not from lifting weights but from years of hauling fence wire and wrestling longhorns out of creek beds. His jaw looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone that formed the canyon walls south of town, and his eyes were a dark, storm-bruised gray that people often mistook for black, until the light caught them just right. He had built his ranch, Graves Land and Cattle, from 40 acres of scrub brush and rattlesnake territory into the largest single privately held parcel between Redrock and the Colorado River. He had done it through hard work, careful saving, and a talent for negotiation that bordered on something almost supernatural. People did not exaggerate when they called him the hardest bargainer in the county. He had once talked a land speculator out of 300 acres for the price of a single water rights agreement and a handshake. He had negotiated cattle prices so far below market value that the rancher on the other side of the deal had not realized what happened until he was already riding home. Seth was not cruel about it, and he was not dishonest. He simply had a quality that most men lacked entirely. He could sit in absolute silence for as long as it took, without blinking, without fidgeting, without betraying a single flicker of what he wanted or what he would accept. Other men would grow uncomfortable in that silence and start talking, and when men started talking, they started offering things they had not intended to offer. Seth would listen patiently, and then he would take exactly what he had come for. He was respected. He was even admired in a guarded sort of way, but very few people in Redrock would say they knew him, and even fewer would claim to be his friend. He came to town on Saturdays for supplies and business. He ate at Clara's diner when he did not feel like cooking, which was rare. He drank 1 glass of whiskey on Saturday evenings at the Black Horse Saloon, not because he craved it particularly, but because it was the place where business conversations happened, and a man who was never there was a man who might miss something important. He had never been married. At 31 in 1874 Texas, that was the sort of thing people noticed. Clara Holt, who ran the diner and considered herself the social conscience of Redrock, had tried on at least 4 separate occasions to arrange some kind of introduction between Seth and one eligible woman or another. Each time, Seth had been polite, distant, and utterly unmoved. He did not dislike women. He simply had no idea, in the deep, honest privacy of himself, how to want something he could not negotiate for, plan for, or bargain his way into owning. He did not yet know that Pauline Shelton was 3 days' ride away, sitting in a stagecoach that smelled of dust and leather, clutching a leather satchel to her chest like it contained everything that mattered in the world, which, as it happened, it did. Pauline Shelton was 26 years old, born in Virginia, raised in Missouri after her father's tobacco farm failed, and the family moved west looking for something better. She had her mother's red-brown hair, thick and prone to escaping whatever arrangement she put it in, and her father's green eyes, sharp and direct in the way that people sometimes found disconcerting in a woman. She was tall for a woman of her time, 5 feet and 7 inches, and she carried herself with a straight-back dignity that had less to do with vanity and more to do with years of being the oldest of 4 children, and learning early that if she did not hold herself together, no one else would. Her father, Thomas Shelton, had died 8 months ago, taken by pneumonia in the Missouri winter before he could see his dream of a Texas cattle ranch come to anything. What he left behind was a deed to 120 acres of land outside Redrock, Texas land. He had purchased sight unseen from a land company 2 years before his death. Land he had talked about with the fevered brightness of a man who needed to believe in something. He had left the land to Pauline because she was the one he trusted, and because her younger siblings were too young to manage it, and because somewhere in his heart he had known she was the strongest of his children, even if he had not always remembered to tell her so. Pauline's mother had remarried quickly after Thomas died, a practical decision that Pauline understood even if it cut her. There was not room enough in her stepfather's modest house for an adult stepdaughter with a deed to Texas land and an independent mind. And so Pauline had packed what she owned into a trunk, put the land deed and her father's letter and a little under $80 in cash into the leather satchel, and pointed herself southwest. She arrived in Redrock on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, when the sun was high and brutal, and the dust on Main Street rose in little orange spirals every time the wind moved. The stagecoach stopped in front of the general store, and Pauline stepped down with her trunk and her satchel and looked around at the flat, dry, endless landscape surrounding the town and thought, with a steadiness that surprised her, that she was going to make this work. She rented a room at the Redrock Hotel, which was a generous word for 2 floors of rough-hewn lumber, 4 rooms per floor, and a shared washstand at the end of the hall. It cost 25 cents a night, which meant her $80 would last her a while, but not forever. She needed to get to her land, assess what was there, and make a plan. On her second morning in Redrock, she went to the land registry office on the north end of Main Street to formally file her inheritance papers and confirm the boundaries of the property. The registrar, a thin, nervous man named Hooper, looked at her deed and then looked at her with an expression that made the back of her neck prickle. "Miss Shelton," he said slowly, "I do need to inform you of something that might be a complication." He explained it carefully, choosing words the way a man chooses his footing on a frozen creek. The 120 acres that Thomas Shelton had purchased were not in dispute. The deed was legitimate. The problem was that approximately 40 acres of the eastern portion of that land, the 40 acres that included the only reliable water source on the property, a spring-fed creek that ran year-round, were also subject to a water rights claim filed 18 months ago by Seth Graves of Graves Land and Cattle. Pauline sat very still. "He filed a claim on water that is on my land," she said. "The water rights law in Texas at this time is complex," Hooper said, not meeting her eyes. "Mr. Graves filed the claim under the doctrine of prior appropriation. His land borders yours on the east, and he argued that the creek, which runs through your property before reaching his, was essential to his cattle operations. Since the land was unoccupied and the previous owner, that would be your father, rest him, had not filed any counterclaim or developed the water source, Mr. Graves's claim was accepted provisionally." "Provisionally," Pauline said. "It can be contested," Hooper said. "But you would need to demonstrate active use of the water source, or negotiate directly with Mr. Graves for a resolution." She thanked Hooper with a pleasantness that was entirely controlled and walked out into the April heat. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment, the leather satchel gripped in both hands, and made herself breathe evenly. Then she asked the first person she saw, a boy of about 12 sweeping the front steps of the general store, where she might find Seth Graves. "He comes in on Saturdays," the boy said. "But his ranch is about 7 miles south on the Ridgeline Road. Big gate with iron letters. You can't miss it." Pauline nodded and went back to the hotel and spent the rest of Tuesday writing a careful, factual letter to Seth Graves explaining who she was, that she was the legal heir to the Shelton land, and that she would appreciate a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss the water rights situation. She sent it with the hotel keeper's son, who agreed to ride out to the Graves ranch for 15 cents. Then she did what she always did when she had done everything she could do for the moment. She organized her remaining resources, wrote a list of priorities, and went to bed. Seth received the letter on Wednesday morning. He read it twice, standing in the doorway of his ranch house with the early sun behind him and his foreman, a weathered Mexican-American man named Rodrigo Vega, pretending to check the fence posts nearby while actually listening with both ears. "Well," Seth said finally. "Trouble?" Rodrigo asked, dropping the pretense. "Thomas Shelton had a daughter," Seth said. "She's inherited the land." Rodrigo made a sound that was not quite a whistle. "That changes things." "It doesn't change the water rights claim," Seth said, folding the letter. "The claim was legally filed. The land was undeveloped. I needed that creek for the East pasture cattle. Still do." "She's asking for a meeting," Rodrigo said, having obviously read the letter from 6 feet away. "She is," Seth agreed. "You going to give her one?" Seth looked at the letter one more time. The handwriting was careful and even, with none of the emotional flourishes he had seen in letters from people who were frightened or trying to manipulate. It read like a person who was neither. He was not sure what to do with that. "I'll ride in Saturday," he said. "She can meet me at the land registry." He sent back a reply, brief and professional, confirming Saturday at 9 o'clock at the Redrock Land Registry office. No pleasantries, no apologies, no explanation of his legal position. Just the time and the place. Pauline received his reply on Thursday. She read it standing in the hotel hallway. Then she folded it and put it in the satchel and said, quietly to herself, "All right, Mr. Graves." She spent Thursday and Friday learning what she could about Seth Graves and about the land itself. She hired a man at the livery to take her out to the Shelton property on Thursday afternoon, riding behind him on a broad-backed bay mare since she did not yet have a horse of her own. What she found was not the total wasteland she had feared, but it was far from ready. There was the shell of a structure that might once have been a line shack, its roof half collapsed, its walls still solid. There was scrub brush and mesquite, and a stretch of rocky pasture that would support cattle if it was worked properly. And there was the creek. She could see where it cut through the eastern portion of her land, silver bright and real, lined with cottonwood trees that were the greenest things she had seen since Missouri. It was beautiful in the way that necessary things are beautiful, and the sight of it made something fierce and certain settle into her chest. That creek was on her land. The water that came from it was hers. And she was going to make sure Seth Graves understood that, even if he was the hardest bargainer in the county. She learned about Seth from Clara Holt at the diner, where she ate supper on Friday evening. Clara was happy to talk, in the way of someone who has been storing up information for years and is pleased to find an interested audience. He was honest, Clara said, but relentless in business. He had built his ranch alone after his father's debts had left him with almost nothing. He did not socialize much. He had never, to Clara's certain knowledge, been seriously involved with any woman, though not for lack of interest from the women in question. He was not unkind, just closed like a house where all the shutters were latched from the inside. "Is he fair?" Pauline asked. Clara considered that. "He's as fair as the land out here is fair," she said finally. "Which is to say, he doesn't intend you harm, but he won't give you anything for free." Pauline thought about that all the way back to the hotel. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear and hot in the way that April in Texas can be hot, full of promise and warning in equal measure. Pauline dressed carefully in her best day dress, brown with cream trim at the collar and cuffs, and put her hair up neatly, and picked up her satchel with the land deed inside it, and walked to the land registry office at 8:45. Seth Graves was already there at 8:50, which meant he had arrived before her despite the 7-mile ride, which meant he had gotten up before dawn and ridden in the dark, which told her something about how seriously he took his business affairs. She had not known what to expect from his appearance exactly. Clara had called him not unhandsome, which in Clara's vocabulary covered a wide range. What Pauline saw when she turned around from looking at the registry map on the wall was a tall man in a clean dark coat over a work shirt, with a hat that had seen better years but was brushed clean, and those gray storm eyes that evaluated her in a single sweep without being rude about it. He had a quality of stillness about him that was immediately noticeable. Most men, when they entered a room, carried their intentions with them like a smell. Seth Graves carried nothing you could read. "Miss Shelton," he said, not warmly, not coldly, simply stating the fact. "Mr. Graves," she said, matching his tone precisely. Hooper let them into the registry office and then found somewhere else to be, which was probably wise. They sat across from each other at the narrow wooden table with the land maps between them. Pauline had the deed and her father's documentation. Seth had a copy of his water rights filing and a survey map. They both put their papers on the table and looked at each other. "I'll be straightforward," Pauline said. "The creek runs through my land. The land was my father's, purchased legally and transferred to me by inheritance. Your water rights claim was filed against land that had an owner, even if that owner was not present. I want the claim withdrawn." Seth looked at her for a moment in that particular way of his. The stillness so complete it was almost unnatural. Then he said, "The claim was filed under the doctrine of prior appropriation on land that showed no sign of development or use. It was legally filed and legally accepted. The fact that the original purchaser died before developing the land does not change the legal standing of the claim. The fact that my father died before he could come here does not mean the land was abandoned," Pauline said. "He paid for it. He held the deed. The land was never legally his to lose, and it is not legally yours to claim water rights on against the will of the title holder." Seth's jaw moved slightly. It might have been a response to what she said, or it might have been nothing. She could not tell. "I have cattle on the east pasture that depend on that creek," he said. "I filed the claim because I had to ensure my operation's viability. I need the water access." "I understand that," Pauline said. "I am not trying to cut you off from the water entirely. I am telling you that the claim as it stands is wrong and I want it resolved." "What resolution are you proposing?" he said. She had thought about this carefully. She had lain awake on Friday night running the numbers, thinking about what she needed and what she could offer, and what the fairest arrangement would look like. She said, "I will grant you a formal water use easement on the eastern section of the creek, clearly documented, that guarantees your cattle access to the water from April through October, the dry months. In exchange, you withdraw the water rights claim, and you acknowledge in writing that the creek and the land it runs through belong to the Shelton property." Something shifted in his eyes. Not warmth, not even interest exactly. More like the slight adjustment a hunter makes when the thing he's been watching does something unexpected. "You've thought about this," he said. "I have," she said. "The easement you're describing covers the season when water access matters most," he said. "But there's a gap in your offer. You're proposing to give me water access in exchange for withdrawing a claim that already gives me water access. What you're offering is essentially what I already have, dressed up in language that benefits you." She had expected this. "What I'm offering," she said evenly, "is legal security for your water access within a framework that correctly establishes ownership. Right now your claim is provisional and subject to contest. If I pursue a full legal challenge, you could lose the claim entirely, and you would spend the next year tied up in a legal process that costs both of us time and money. I am offering you certainty in exchange for accuracy. That is the deal." The silence stretched. Seth looked at the map on the table, then he looked at her. "What are you planning to do with the land?" he asked. "Cattle," she said. "And possibly some crops along the lower field if the soil tests well. I intend to work the land myself and build a proper operation." "Yourself," he said. "With hired help when I can afford it," she said. "But yes, myself. I know how to work." She said it without defiance, just as a fact, the same way she might state that water runs downhill. Something in his expression changed again, too slight to be called a reaction by most observers, but she was watching carefully. "The easement language would need to be specific," he said. Quantity of access, hours, boundaries, not just months. I agree, she said. Hooper can draft it. Another silence, slightly different from the first ones. Less like a wall, and more like a door he hadn't decided whether to open. Then Seth Graves, who was the hardest bargainer in the county and had not lost a negotiation in longer than anyone could remember, said, "All right, Miss Shelton. I'll accept the easement in exchange for withdrawing the claim, but I want the language reviewed by Tuesday." "Tuesday is fine," she said. They shook hands across the narrow table. His grip was firm and brief and exactly what she had expected. His eyes, up close, were not black at all. They were a gray so deep they held light the way deep water does, not reflecting it back but pulling it in and holding it somewhere below the surface. She walked out of the land registry office into the April morning and allowed herself, once she was around the corner and out of sight, one single breath of relief so sharp it was almost a laugh. Seth walked out 30 seconds later and stood on the sidewalk looking south toward where his ranch lay, and felt something that he would not have been able to name if someone had asked him, which was a vague and slightly alarming awareness that the meeting had not gone entirely the way he had planned, and that the person responsible for that was interesting to him in a way that was not about land or water or business at all. He rode home and said nothing to Rodrigo except that the Shelton matter was being resolved by legal easement. Rodrigo, who knew Seth better than anyone else alive, watched his employer unsaddle the horse with slightly more forcefulness than usual and thought about asking a question, then thought better of it. The easement document was drafted and signed by the following Wednesday, with Hooper witnessing and both parties keeping copies. Legally, the matter was settled. Practically, what had been resolved was the question of who held what right to what water. What had not been resolved, what had in fact been quietly opened without either of them fully realizing it, was something considerably harder to close again. Pauline moved onto the Shelton land the following week. She hired 2 men from town to help her repair the line shack into something livable, a process that took 10 days of hard work, during which she did her share of the hauling and hammering, and was regarded by both hired men with the particular mix of respect and bafflement that capable women in 1874, Texas, tended to produce in men who had not encountered many. She bought a horse, a gray mare she called June, because the horse had the look of something patient and long-sustained. She bought basic supplies, tools, seed, and made arrangements with the general store for a monthly account she would pay against her cattle proceeds once she had any. She had no cattle yet. That was the next and most pressing problem. On the 3rd Saturday after the signing of the easement, Seth came into Redrock and ran into Pauline outside the general store, where she was loading supplies into June's saddlebags with the efficient, no-wasted motion focus that he had already come to associate with her in his mind. He had seen her once from a distance in the intervening weeks, riding the boundary of her land on June with a surveyor's eye, taking notes in a small book she kept in her breast pocket. He had not stopped to speak with her on that occasion because there had been no reason to. He told himself the same thing now, and then found himself walking over anyway. "Miss Shelton," he said. "Mr. Graves," she said, pausing in her loading without quite stopping, which meant she was acknowledging him without giving him any advantage. He noticed this. "You look like you're settling in," he said, which was not what he had planned to say because he had not planned to say anything. "Making progress," she said. "The structure is sound now. I need to address the eastern fence line before summer, and I need to acquire stock." She finished tying a feed sack and looked at him directly. "You wouldn't happen to know of any cattle for sale at reasonable prices in the area?" He knew of 3 potential sources immediately, because knowing the cattle market in the area was simply how his mind worked. He said, "Tom Briggs over at the Double T has been looking to thin his herd before the summer drive. Older stock mostly, but solid. He'd deal reasonable." "How reasonable?" she said. "For a smaller purchase, 40, 50 head. I'd expect he'd want $14 a head, but he'd come down to 12 for a straight cash deal." Pauline pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, not the surveying one, a different one, and made a note. "Is he honest?" she asked. "As honest as a man who knows what he's got and doesn't want to take a loss on it," Seth said. "Which is as honest as you're likely to find." She looked up from the notebook. The morning light was coming from behind the general store, falling at an angle across her face, and her eyes in that light were very green and very direct. "Would you introduce me?" she said. A man like that might deal differently with a woman he doesn't know than with someone he's established business with. It was a practical request, plainly stated, with no pretense about it. The honest truth of what she was asking, that his name and his presence would smooth a transaction that her gender might complicate, was spoken aloud instead of hidden under politeness, and that directness did something to his chest that he had not expected. "I can do that," he said. "Briggs usually receives visitors on Wednesday mornings." "Wednesday morning works for me," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Graves." He nodded and walked toward his own errands and tried to think about what he needed at the hardware store, and found that his mind kept sliding back to green eyes and a pocket notebook, and the way she had said, simply and without drama, "I know how to work." They rode out to Tom Briggs's Double T Ranch on Wednesday morning, Seth on his dark bay gelding and Pauline on June, and the ride was 7 miles through the low, scrubby Texas hill country with the early spring wildflowers, bluebonnets, and Indian paintbrush, still bright in the roadsides, and the morning air smelling of cedar and warming earth. Seth talked about Tom Briggs for the first mile or so, laying out the relevant facts, the man's history, his cattle operation, his preferred way of being approached in business. He was thorough and specific in the way of someone who had learned that preparation was the foundation of every good negotiation. Pauline listened without interrupting, which Seth found remarkable. Most people either asked too many questions or stopped listening before you were finished. She did neither. When he was done, she said, "What does he think of women in business?" Seth thought about it. "He married a woman who ran the household accounts and the garden operation and made more money on the vegetables than he made on cattle one bad year," he said. "He doesn't talk about it much, but he knows what competent looks like." "Good," she said, and looked out across the landscape with that expression she sometimes had, measuring and steady, like she was figuring the distance to the horizon and finding it manageable. They rode in silence for a while. It should have been uncomfortable, because the silence between two people who barely know each other usually is. It was not uncomfortable. Seth could not have explained why, except that her silences had the same quality as his own, not empty, not awkward, but full of thought and comfortable in the way that a solid room is comfortable. "Your father bought the land sight unseen," he said eventually, not as a question. "He did," she said. "He bought it from a land company in St. Louis. He saw a map and a description and he bought it on faith." "That's a risky thing to do," Seth said. "He was a man who needed to believe in something at the end of his life," Pauline said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a kind of steady love for someone she had known well and lost. The land was the thing he believed in. "I intend to make sure that faith was not entirely misplaced." Seth said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The land is good, the spring is reliable, the eastern pasture grows strong grass in wet years. Will this be a wet year? Hard to say in April. The signs are mixed." He looked up at the sky as though reading it. "But even in dry years the creek doesn't fail, that's why I needed the water rights." "I know," she said without accusation, just acknowledgement. They reached the Double T, and Tom Briggs met them in the yard. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a voice like a wagon wheel, and the kind of handshake that was meant to tell you something about his character. He greeted Seth with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, and turned to Pauline with cautious politeness that became, over the course of the next hour and a half, something more like respect. Pauline had done her arithmetic. She had figured exactly what she could spend, what price range was viable, and what minimum herd size she needed to begin a sustainable cattle operation. She let Seth handle the initial pleasantries, And then she sat at Tom Briggs's kitchen table and talked cattle breeds, weights, temperaments in the Texas heat, the water requirements of 30 head versus 40, the grade of the Shelton land's grass and what it could sustain in a dry year. Tom Briggs, who had been prepared to be patient with a woman who didn't know what she was looking at, found himself engaged in a genuine conversation about cattle management. And by the time they got to price, he was no longer thinking of her as someone to be handled carefully. She got 38 head at $11.50 each, and Tom Briggs threw in a week of his ranch hand's time to help drive them to the Shelton property. Seth, watching from a few feet away over a cup of coffee that he had somehow ended up holding, understood that he was witnessing something. Not just a good deal, but the particular result of preparation and clarity and the refusal to be dismissed, meeting a person who was honest enough to recognize them. On the ride back, he said, $11.50. I did not come here to pay 12, she said. No, he said. I see that. The wildflowers were different on the return ride because the light was different, full afternoon now instead of morning, turning everything gold-edged and long-shadowed. June walked with the comfortable sway of a horse that has had a satisfying day's work, and Pauline rode with one hand on the reins and the other resting on her leg, and Seth rode beside her, and thought about what it would be like to ride this road every day with someone beside him, and was both startled and unsettled by the thought. He put it away in the place where he put things he was not ready to examine, which was a place that had been accumulating items since the first morning he read Pauline Shelton's careful, factual letter. "Thank you," she said, when they reached the fork where the roads to their respective properties separated. The introduction made a difference. "You would have gotten there without it," he said, and meant it. She looked at him for a moment in the afternoon light, and something in her expression was thoughtful and open in a way her expressions usually were not, or perhaps they always were that way, and he was only now seeing it clearly. "I might have," she said, "but it was kind of you to come." He watched her ride east toward the creek, and the line shack and the 38 head of cattle she would be collecting at the end of the week, and he stayed at the fork longer than was strictly necessary before turning south toward his own gate. The cattle arrived on a Friday in early May, driven by Tom Briggs's hand, a young man named Charlie, and Pauline herself on June, working the edges of the small herd with a confidence that told Seth's foreman Rodrigo, who happened to be riding the fence line that bordered her eastern pasture, that this woman had been around cattle before. He mentioned this to Seth at supper, somewhat unnecessarily, because Seth had already arrived at the same conclusion on the basis of how she talked about water requirements and grass grades and the temperament of longhorns in the heat. Rodrigo watched Seth not react to the mention of Pauline Shelton and thought about asking a question again and again decided against it. May moved into a warm green summer, and Pauline worked her land with a steadiness that became something of a quiet topic in Redrock. She was in town once a week for supplies, always polite, always purposeful, never lingering for gossip but occasionally stopping to talk seriously with Clara Holt or the blacksmith or the man at the feed store about practical matters. People liked her, in the measured way people in a frontier town like, someone who does what they say and does not complain loudly about the difficulty of it. Seth found reasons to ride the fence line that bordered her eastern pasture with some frequency, which he justified to himself on the grounds that the fence was old and needed monitoring, which was true, but not the whole truth. On a Thursday in late May, he found her on the wrong side of the fence, not trespassing, but standing at the creek's edge with her boots off and her feet in the water and her hat in her hand, looking up at the cottonwood trees with an expression of such unguarded peace that he felt he had seen something private and almost stopped his horse and turned around. He did not stop, and she heard the horse and looked around and put her hat back on without embarrassment. "The cottonwoods are beautiful," she said. "I look at them every evening. I think they're the thing that sold my father on this land when he saw it described." Seth dismounted and stood at the fence line, his horse cropping grass behind him. "They were here before the town," he said. "The creeks always run." "Have you always lived here?" she asked. "My father brought us here in 1858, he said. "I was 15. He bought a small parcel on the south side of the ridge, ran it badly, died in debt. I worked off the debt and bought this land in sections over 8 years." She looked at him with the same steady attention she gave to everything, the same quality of really listening. "That's a great deal of work," she said. "It's what there was to do," he said. She put her boots back on and stood up, and they walked along the fence line together for a while, she on her side, he on his, talking about the coming summer heat and the state of the grass, and what the other Redrock ranchers were doing about the dry patches to the south. It was entirely practical conversation, and it lasted 45 minutes, and Seth rode home afterward in a state of something that felt uncomfortably like happiness, which he found profoundly suspicious. June slid into July, and the Texas summer settled over the land like a physical weight, pressing everything flat and still in the middle of the day. The creek ran lower than in spring but still ran, and Pauline managed her herd's water access with careful rotation that Seth observed, when he passed that way, with the evaluating eye of a man who knows good land management when he sees it. She had also, at some point in June, managed to establish a small kitchen garden against the shack's south wall, using the creek water efficiently, and there were rows of beans and squash, and tomatoes growing with the slightly surprised vitality of things that had been planted in hostile soil and decided to thrive anyway. He started stopping to talk when he rode past. Not always, not with any pattern that could be called deliberate, but often enough that by July Rodrigo had stopped pretending not to notice and had instead taken to looking slightly pleased whenever Seth saddled up and said he was going to check the east fence. One evening in mid-July, Seth arrived at the fence to find Pauline standing in the yard with a rifle, which startled him until he saw what she was looking at: a coyote at the edge of the scrub brush, too close to the hen yard she had recently established. She fired once, and the coyote departed at speed into the brush, and she lowered the rifle with the businesslike calm of a woman who is not afraid of coyotes but is not fond of them either. "Good shot," he said. "Good warning shot," she corrected. "I wasn't trying to hit it. I just wanted it to know the yard is not worth the trouble." He looked at her standing there in the long evening light with the rifle balanced across her arm and her hair escaping its pins in the heat. And the item in the interior place he kept things he was not ready to examine grew considerably heavier and harder to ignore. He stayed for supper that evening for the first time, because she asked him plainly if he had eaten, and he said no, and she said she had made enough stew for 2, and there was no reason to waste it. The stew was excellent, made with dried beans and the beef jerky she kept stored and the tomatoes from the garden, and they ate at the small table in the repaired shack with the door open to catch the evening breeze and talked about cattle prices and the coming fall drive, and whether the east pasture would recover after the dry July. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, when the practical talk had run its natural course. "Something that isn't about land." He looked at her across the small table. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you'd like to say," she said. "We've been neighbors for 3 months, and I know the dimensions of your east pasture, and I don't know anything else." He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I read," he said finally. "I have a crate of books from the St. Louis book dealers. I order from them twice a year." She looked genuinely interested. "What do you read?" "Everything I can get," he said. "History, natural science, fiction when it's good." "I brought 12 books with me from Missouri," she said. "I had to choose carefully because of the space in the trunk. I left behind a whole shelf, and it was like leaving people behind." He understood this completely and said so, and she looked at him with a slight widening of her eyes, as though she had expected to have to explain it further, and the fact that she did not need to seemed to mean something to her. They talked about books for an hour while the evening cooled around them and the cattle settled in the east pasture, and the stars came out over the Texas sky one by one. He rode home in full dark, which he had not done in years, because there had not been anywhere worth staying until dark. August brought a crisis. A stretch of dry weeks that turned the southern pastures brown and sent the water level in the creek to its lowest point of the summer brought trouble in the form of 3 of Pauline's cattle breaking through the eastern fence in search of the deeper, more accessible pool that lay on Seth's side of the creek boundary, in a natural hollow that his cattle used. She found the break on a Monday morning and the 3 cattle grazing contentedly in Seth's pasture, and she went immediately to repair the fence and retrieve the cattle before Seth found them there. She was halfway through the repair when Seth arrived on horseback, having spotted the break from his morning ride. He assessed the situation in about 4 seconds. The broken fence posts, Pauline already working on them, the 3 cattle cropping his grass without a care in the world, and dismounted. "They went through the night," Pauline said, not stopping her work. "The posts were older than I realized. I'm fixing it now." "I know," he said, and picked up the second post hammer without being asked and began working on the section she hadn't reached yet. They fixed the fence together in about 40 minutes, working in easy silence, occasionally broken by practical observations about the dry condition and the state of the creek. When it was done, she wrangled the 3 SKP cattle back through the repaired gate with June's help and his, and the whole business was resolved by 10 in the morning. Then they both stood on either side of the repaired fence looking at each other, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "Your cattle were on my land," he said. "Fixing the fence was in my interest too." "You know that's not why you helped," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different from her usual practical directness, something quieter and more certain. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't." It was the most honest thing either of them had said. That was not about cattle or land or water, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything else. But something shifted in the air between them, like a door that had been leaning closed finally settling open, and neither of them reached to push it shut. He started coming by in the evenings more regularly after that, and it became, without being discussed or declared, a simple fact of the summer. Seth Graves rode the east fence on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and on those evenings he stopped at the Shelton property, and Pauline had always made enough for 2. They talked about everything and nothing, about books and the history of the Texas frontier and the politics of the Reconstruction era, and whether the cattle market would improve in the fall, and what Pauline's plans were for the winter, and what Seth had found in the arroyo to the south that suggested an old Comanche camp from before the Red River War. They argued sometimes, not angrily but with the engaged energy of 2 people who are both accustomed to thinking carefully and don't mind being challenged. Pauline pushed back on his assessments when she disagreed, directly and specifically, and he respected this enormously even when it was frustrating, which was often. He found, without entirely meaning to, that she was the first person in longer than he could remember with whom he was not managing the conversation, not measuring his words, not calculating advantage, not working toward a conclusion. He was simply talking. It scared him when he thought about it directly. So mostly, he did not think about it directly and instead thought about the fence line and the fall herd, and whether the bean crop had come in well, and let what was happening between them accumulate like savings in a bank he was pretending not to own. Pauline was less inclined to avoid looking at things directly, but she was patient. She had learned patience the hard way, through years of being the one who held the family together, and she understood that things moved at the pace they moved, and you could not force them without breaking something. She knew what she felt. She had known since the Wednesday afternoon when he had helped her fix the fence without being asked, and she had stood on her side of the repaired fence and seen the look on his face that he had not quite managed to keep neutral, something exposed and wanting and frightened all at once, the look of a man who is discovering, against all prior planning, that he wants something he has no framework for wanting. She offered him nothing he had not already shown her he wanted. She simply made sure the door stayed open. September brought cooler air and the preparations for the fall cattle drive, and with it came the social reality of Redrock's annual harvest gathering, a tradition of some years standing hosted at the town square, involving a supper and square dancing and a good deal of conversation and not a little whiskey. It was the social event of Redrock's small season, and essentially everyone went. Clara Holt found Pauline at the general store the week before the gathering and asked her if she was attending. "I intend to," Pauline said. Clara's face did the thing it did when she was controlling excitement which Pauline had learned to recognize. "Seth Graves is always there," Clara said with elaborate casualness. "Is he?" Pauline said. "He doesn't usually stay for the dancing," Clara said. "He has one whiskey and talks cattle prices and leaves." "That sounds like him," Pauline said. "It would be something," Clara said, "if he stayed for the dancing this year." "It would," Pauline agreed, with a small smile that told Clara everything while appearing to say nothing, and went back to selecting her dry goods. The gathering was on a Saturday in the middle of September, and the evening was warm and the town square was lit with lanterns strung on lines between the buildings, turning everything amber and soft. The fiddle player from the Black Horse Saloon was there with his banjo-playing partner, and there was a long table of food, and the people of Redrock were dressed in their best with the slightly self-conscious brightness of people who work hard and earn their pleasures. Pauline came in a dark green dress she had brought from Missouri, never quite finding the occasion to wear it until now, with her hair arranged more carefully than usual, and the leather satchel left at home for the first time since she had arrived. Seth came in at 8 o'clock in his good coat, which was a dark wool that fit him properly, and Clara Holt watched him spot Pauline from across the square with the focused attention of someone who has laid a modest wager on the outcome. He walked to where she was standing with Rodrigo's wife Maria and said, "Miss Shelton, you look well." "Thank you," she said. "You're wearing your good coat." The corners of his mouth moved very slightly. "It's a gathering," he said. "It is," she said. They talked and circulated, not always together but gravitating back toward each other the way two objects in proximity do when one of them has sufficient gravity. The whiskey was drunk, the food was eaten, the fiddle struck up a reel that brought people onto the square's open center. Seth had been edging toward the direction of his horse for 20 minutes, making the right social rounds before departing, when Pauline appeared at his shoulder and said, "Dance with me." Not asking exactly, not demanding exactly, something between with a warmth to it that the asking framing would not have contained. He looked at her. The lantern light turned her hair to copper and her dress to deep forest, and her eyes were on him with that direct green steadiness. "I'm not a good dancer," he said. "I am," she said. "So it evens out." He was aware that at least 4 people nearby, Clara Holt chief among them, were attempting to look as though they were not watching. He was aware that his chest was doing something that was entirely inconsistent with being the hardest bargainer in the county. He was aware that he had been moving steadily, for the past 4 months, toward exactly this moment, and that all his careful not thinking had not actually stopped the movement, just delayed the moment of acknowledging it. He held out his hand. She took it, and they stepped into the reel with the other couples, and Seth Graves was not a good dancer in the technical sense, but he was steady and strong, and he moved with the same quality of focused attention he brought to everything, and Pauline guided them both through the turns with an ease that made it seem as though they had danced together before. They were both laughing by the third turn, genuinely laughing at the near collision with the Hooper family and the recovery from it, and Seth's laugh, which he apparently used rarely enough that Clara Holt pressed her hand to her heart when she heard it, was a low, warm sound that Pauline felt as much as heard. When the reel ended and the fiddle slowed into something quieter, he did not let go of her hand, and she did not take it back, and they stood in the amber lantern light breathing slightly fast from the dancing, closer than they had ever been, and the conversation that had been building for 4 months in fence lines and stew dinners, and the silences between practical topics rose up around them like the evening air. I think about you, Seth said, and the simplicity of it, coming from a man who measured every word he said, was so unguarded it almost knocked the breath from her. Considerably more than is reasonable or useful. I think about you too, she said. Constantly and in a way that I stopped trying to call something else about 2 months ago. He looked at her with those deep gray eyes that held light without giving it back, and what she saw in them now was not closed or managed or still. It was open. It was unmistakably tender. I don't know how to do this, he said. I have spent 15 years making sure I know how to do everything I choose to do. I do not have a plan for this. No plan is required, she said. That's actually the point. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very quietly, Pauline, just her name. The first time he had used it, and the way he said it with a care that suggested he had been holding it for a while, the way you hold something valuable made her close her eyes for 1 second. Seth, she said, and opened them again. He lifted his free hand and tucked a strand of copper hair behind her ear with a gentleness that was so much at odds with every hard-edged, efficient thing she knew about him that it made her throat ache in the best possible way. I would like to court you properly, he said. If you'd allow it, not efficiently. She laughed at that, a real laugh, bright and warm. Not efficiently, she agreed. That would be a change from your usual. A significant one, he said, with the slight almost smile that she had learned to read as the outside of something much larger inside. But I think I would like to try. Then try, she said, and squeezed his hand, and the fiddle played on into the September night. The Autumn Courting of Pauline Shelton by Seth Graves was, by the standards of Redrock, Texas in 1874, not done entirely by the book. There was no formal calling on a father or guardian, because Pauline had neither present, and she would not have required it in any case. What it was real. Seth came on Sunday afternoons now, openly, and without pretending the fence needed checking, and they rode out together across the hill country and the creek lands and the low mesas to the south, sometimes talking the whole ride and sometimes riding in the companionable silence that had always been the language they both spoke most naturally. He brought her books from his crate, a history of the frontier settlements, a natural science text with illustrations of the Texas flora that she spent a whole evening reading while he sat across from her, and read his own book and felt, with a warmth he was slowly learning to not be alarmed by, that this was what he had been building toward all this time without knowing it. Not just the land and the ranch and the financial security, but this, a table and a lamp and someone worth reading beside. She came to his ranch for the first time on an October Sunday, and he showed her the operation with the pride and the slight vulnerability of someone showing you something they have made with their own hands. The ranch house was solid and larger than she had expected, built from limestone blocks he had quarried himself over 3 summers, with a wide porch along the south face and a well in the yard, and a barn that was probably better constructed than most houses in Redrock. The interior was clean and spare, and had the look of a man who knows what he needs and has exactly that and nothing extra, except for the crate of books beside the fireplace, which was 2 crates, actually, and overflowing. It's beautiful, she said, standing on the south porch looking out over the pastures to the distant line of the creek, where the cottonwoods were turning gold in the October air. It's functional, he said, and she looked at him with that expression she sometimes had, the one that said she saw more than he was offering. It's both, she said. You build things that work and they end up beautiful because they work so well. That's a particular kind of beauty. He looked at her for a long moment, and then said, You are the only person I have ever brought here who said something I have always privately thought and not known how to say. She felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time, perhaps since her father died and the world shifted under her feet, and she thought that this was where settling happened, not in the geography but in the person. October deepened and the cattle drive preparation occupied both of them, and they worked the logistics of their respective drives with the practical efficiency of 2 operations that had, quietly and informally, begun consulting each other as a matter of course. Seth suggested combining a portion of the drives to reduce cost, since their herds were going to the same market in San Antonio, and the roads overlapped for the first 60 miles. Pauline agreed, and they rode the first 2 days south together with their combined herds and their respective hands. Seth's crew of 3 and Pauline's newly acquired second hire, alongside Charlie, Tom Briggs's former hand who had stayed on after the cattle delivery, because Pauline had offered him fair wages and consistent work. Rodrigo, who had worked with Seth for 7 years and was not a sentimental man by nature, watched his employer ride beside Pauline Shelton in the dust and morning light of the first drive morning, and felt something that was probably satisfaction or possibly relief. Seth, looking at the road ahead, seemed simply to have acquired something that years of land acquisition and careful bargaining and absolute control had not included. A quality of easiness that Rodrigo had not seen in him since they were both young, and the land was still something to dream about rather than manage. On the second night of the drive, camped in the low hills north of the Guadalupe River with the cattle settled, and the fires burning and the hands playing cards at the second fire, Seth and Pauline sat apart from the others in the way that 2 people sit when the gap between them has become noticeably smaller than the gap between them and everyone else. The sky above them was the enormous, star-scattered sky that only exists where there are no other lights, dense and brilliant and humbling. "I want to ask you something," Seth said. He was looking at the stars, which told her that the asking was going to cost him something, because Seth Graves looked at the thing he was negotiating for directly, and he only looked away when he was negotiating with himself. "Ask," she said. He turned to look at her then, and the firelight caught his face and his eyes were open in the way they had been at the harvest gathering, wide and honest and stripped of every professional habit. "Would you marry me?" he said. "I have been trying to work out for the past month how to put the question in a way that would be compelling and well-structured and demonstrate why the arrangement would be mutually beneficial. And every time I try, the whole architecture falls apart because what I actually want to say is just that I love you and I want to spend my life with you. And I don't know how to make that into a proper argument because it isn't an argument. It's just true." Pauline was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness a night bird called. "It's the best thing you've ever said," she said, "and you've said some very good things. Is that a yes?" He asked with a slight roughness in his voice that she understood was vulnerability held carefully. "Seth," she said, "I came to Texas with $80, a broken deed, and a dead man's dream, and I sat across a table from the hardest bargainer in the county and I held my own. And that was the day I knew you were the man I was going to fall in love with. I have been in love with you since approximately the day you helped me fix the fence without being asked. Yes, it is an absolute yes." He reached over and took her hand, not the way he had at the harvest gathering, not the formal taking of a dance partner's hand, but the way a man takes the hand of someone he has finally stopped trying not to want, intertwining his fingers with hers and holding on. She leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat that way under the enormous stars for a long time, and the cattle grazed in the darkness, and the fires burned down slowly, and neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. They arrived in San Antonio 3 days later, sold their cattle at the market, Pauline getting a price that made the broker blink twice and reassess his initial offering, and rode back north through the October country as a pair that everyone who saw them on the road could see, without being told, was not merely a business arrangement. They were married in Redrock on a Saturday in November, in the church with the crooked steeple, which was decorated for the occasion with the late wildflowers that Clara Holt had somehow managed to gather from the last warm corners of the surrounding countryside. Clara cried, which she had predicted she would not do, and then did anyway. Rodrigo stood beside Seth with the wooden expression of a man who is deeply moved and has decided that showing it is not his custom. Charlie and the other hand sat in the second pew and cleaned up as well as working men ever clean up, and Tom Briggs came in from the double T and sat in the back and nodded with the approving look of a man who had observed the beginning of something without knowing it at the time. The preacher's name was Miller, a thin young man from Ohio who had been in Redrock for less than a year, and who performed the ceremony with a sincere gravity that suited the occasion. Seth stood at the front of the church in his good dark coat and watched Pauline come down the short aisle in the cream-colored dress she had sewn herself from fabric she had chosen carefully at the general store over 3 successive visits, and his face did the thing that it almost never did, which was to show exactly and completely what he felt without the filter of thought or management. And what was on his face was a kind of joy so quiet and deep it was almost solemn, the way the finest things sometimes are. She came to stand beside him and they faced the preacher, and she could feel Seth's hand find hers without looking, steady and certain. The words were said, the vows were exchanged. The small congregation heard Seth Graves say, "I do," in a voice that held nothing back and was moved accordingly. When the preacher said he could kiss his bride, Seth turned to Pauline and cupped her face in both his large weathered hands as though she were something he intended to hold very carefully for the rest of his life, and kissed her with a gentleness that was so incongruent with the reputation of the hardest bargainer in the county that Clara Holt pressed both hands to her heart and made a sound that she would afterwards claim was entirely involuntary. They rode home to Seth's ranch, to their ranch now, in the late November afternoon, and the hills were tawny and gold in the slanting light, and the sky was the particular clear cold blue of a Texas November. And Pauline sat on June beside Seth's dark bay and looked at the land, her land now in the fullest sense, and felt the accumulation of everything, the grief of her father's death, the uncertainty of the journey west, the first hard months alone on the creek land, the careful negotiation at the registry table, the fence repaired together in the August heat, the dancing at the harvest gathering settle into something resolved and whole and good. They had moved the essential things from the line shack to the ranch house already, including the 12 books from Missouri, which found a place in the crates beside the fireplace beside Seth's books, a mingling that felt appropriate and right. That first winter in the ranch house, Pauline learned the particular satisfaction of sharing a space with someone whose domestic rhythms complemented your own: the early rising, the practical efficiency, the quiet evenings with books and conversation, and the fire built against the Texas winter that was cold despite what people said about the South. She organized the kitchen with a thoroughness that Seth observed with admiration and no small amount of humility, and he showed her the account books with a transparency that surprised her and touched her, because a man who guards his negotiating position as carefully as Seth does not show his full financial picture without meaning something by it. She brought the Creek property formally into their combined operation in the spring of 1875, integrating the Shelton herd with the Graves cattle under a single management structure, and expanding into the eastern pasture with a confidence that the combined water access now allowed. They hired 2 additional hands, bringing Rodrigo up to a crew of 5, and the operation grew in the methodical, sustainable way that Seth had always built things, and that Pauline had always planned things, which was to say steadily and with clear intention and without waste. The injustice of the original water rights claim was a thing they talked about once, directly, in the spring of their first married year, Pauline asking Seth plainly whether he had known the land had an owner when he filed. He said yes. He had known it was owned but had not made inquiries about the owner's situation before filing, and that was a failure of fairness on his part that he acknowledged without excuse. She accepted the acknowledgement and moved forward from it, and the ease with which she did this, not dismissing the thing but not holding it over him either, taught him something about the kind of justice that has grace in it, the kind that is not interested in punishment but in accuracy. It was also in the spring of 1875 that they first discussed, in the practical Pauline and Seth style, the question of children, which led to a conversation about the ranch's future and the size of the operation, and whether the land could sustain a larger family, which led to a calculation of resources and a conclusion that yes, it could, and which ended with Seth looking at Pauline across the supper table with that quiet, deep look of his and saying, "I would like a family if you would." "I would," she said, with the warmth of someone who has given it serious thought and arrives at wanting what she wanted all along. Their son was born in January of 1876, in the ranch house, with the midwife from Redrock and Maria Vega both present, and Seth pacing the length of the south porch in the cold January night with a steadiness that he maintained through sheer force of will, and that Rodrigo, keeping him company with a lamp and a blanket and the quiet solidarity of a man who had been through this twice himself, recognized as the most scared he had ever seen Seth Graves. When Maria opened the door and said, "You have a son, Seth. Come in," he went in with the particular swiftness of a man who has been holding himself very still, and what he found was Pauline, exhausted and strong and entirely herself, holding a small red-faced child who was already making his opinions known to the room in general, and the look on Seth's face when he crossed to her bedside and looked at them, both was something that Rodrigo and Maria both felt privileged to have witnessed. They named him Thomas, after Pauline's father. Thomas, who had bought land sight unseen on faith and died before he could see it come to anything. Thomas, who had believed in the West when belief was all he had. It seemed right to plant that name in the land he had loved from a distance, to let it take root in the Texas soil and grow. Thomas Seth Graves was a large-voiced, dark-eyed, relentlessly curious child who took his first steps at 11 months across the wide plank floor of the ranch house, and his first fall directly into the fireplace screen, which he pulled down with him without injury to himself or the screen, and who demonstrated from approximately his second year of life a talent for negotiating more snack portions out of both parents that Seth privately found hilarious, and Pauline found both hilarious and somewhat concerning. Clara Holt spoiled him extravagantly every Saturday when they came to town, which Pauline told her was very kind and Seth told her was a problem, and both of them actually agreed was fine. Rodrigo and Maria's daughter Estella, who was 3 years older than Thomas, regarded him with the tolerant affection of a child who is used to being the only young person around and is not entirely sure what to make of competition but decides, on balance, that having someone to boss around is acceptable. They grew up with the informal, deep familiarity of children raised on neighboring parcels of the same land, and the friendship between the families, Seth and Rodrigo, Pauline and Maria, was the kind that forms in frontier places where community is a necessity and not a luxury, and where shared hard work creates bonds that gossip and social convenience cannot. The years moved through seasons and work, and the accumulating texture of a life fully lived. In 1877, Pauline planted the kitchen garden on a larger scale, converting a section of the near pasture into a productive market garden that supplied not just their household, but a portion of Redrock's general store through a commercial arrangement she negotiated herself, which Seth observed with the particular pride of someone who loves the sight of another person being entirely themselves. In 1878, the cattle market had a difficult year, and they weathered it through the water access and the garden income and the careful reserve that both of them, separately and together, had always maintained, and they came out the other side of it with the operation intact and a clear understanding of what they had built together. In the fall of 1878, Pauline told Seth that she was expecting again. He was repairing tack in the barn when she told him, and he put down the leather and the awl with the careful deliberateness of someone buying himself a second to feel everything properly. And then he looked at her, and his expression held everything gratitude, love. The quiet awe of a man who had spent 15 years building a life out of sheer work and determination, and had not known until he was 31 years old standing in a land registry office that the most important thing he would ever do was put down the negotiating armor and let someone in. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Strong. You know me." "I do," he said, and stood up and crossed to her and held her, which was what she had wanted and what he had learned, over 3 years of marriage, was always the right answer. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1879, and they named her Rose after no one in particular but the word itself, which both of them liked for reasons they couldn't entirely articulate, something about what grows in difficult places. Rose Paulette Graves came into the world with her mother's red-brown hair and her father's storm-colored eyes, and a disposition of sunny tenacity that made both her parents laugh on the daily basis that small children who are completely themselves will make you laugh if you are paying attention. By 1880, the Graves Ranch was one of the most well-regarded operations in Coulter County. Not the largest, there were richer men with bigger parcels, but the most respected, because it was clean and well-managed and produced consistent quality, and because the people who ran it had a reputation for dealing squarely that Seth's negotiating prowess had never compromised and Pauline's directness had only reinforced. When people came to do business at the Graves Ranch, they knew they would get a fair price and straight talk and the kind of handshake that means something. They also knew, if they arrived around supper time, that they were likely to be offered a plate of whatever Pauline had made, which was always better than it needed to be, and to find Seth Graves reading at the kitchen table with one child in his lap and another climbing the bookcase in the background, and wearing an expression of such uncomplicated contentment that people who had known him in the hard, solitary years sometimes had to look twice to make sure it was the same man. It was the same man. He had simply, as Pauline put it once, been introduced to himself. Thomas was 5 and Rose was a year old when the town of Redrock had its first real civic expansion, with the coming of the rail line that brought new commerce and new people, and the particular excitement of a town discovering that it is not, as it had sometimes feared, going to be left behind by the moving West, but is instead being overtaken by it. Seth was on the committee that negotiated the land terms with the railroad company, which the railroad's representative would later describe, in a letter to the company's main office, as the most challenging 2 days of professional conversation he had experienced in his decade of railroad land acquisition, and which Seth described to Pauline afterward simply as not particularly difficult. Pauline laughed at this from across the supper table, and Thomas looked between his parents with the bright-eyed attention of a child who has learned that the things the adults find funny are often the most interesting things, even when you don't understand them yet. "What was the final price?" she asked. 15% above what they intended to offer, Seth said. "Of course it was," she said. Rose, who was learning to pull herself up on furniture and experimenting with gravity in a variety of ways, chose this moment to sit down unexpectedly on the kitchen floor and look surprised, and Seth was up from his chair and across the room to her in about 2 seconds, which was faster than Pauline had ever seen him move for anything involving a negotiation, and crouched down and said, "All right," with a gentleness that still, 4 years into their marriage, could catch her off guard. Rose looked at him with great gray-green eyes and said, with the solemn authority of a 1-year-old, "Up," and he picked her up and held her against his shoulder and returned to the table, and they finished supper in the warm noise and order of a family that has found its shape. The summer of 1880 was the summer Pauline turned 32 and Seth turned 37, and on the evening of Pauline's birthday, which fell on a Saturday in July, Seth rode into Redrock in the morning and came back with a package wrapped in brown paper that he put on the kitchen table and said simply, "For you." She opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of the collected works of Jane Austen, bound in good leather, ordered from the St. Louis book dealers, with an inscription in Seth's characteristically spare handwriting on the first page, For Pauline, who offered me something I had no price for. All of my love, Seth. She looked at the inscription for a long time. Then she looked at him, standing on the other side of the table in the Saturday evening light, her husband of 3 years, the man who had come to her land registry meeting fully prepared to negotiate her into a corner and had walked out of it undone by a pair of green eyes and a pocket notebook, and the way she had said, "I know how to work," like it was simply a fact of nature. "You had no price," she said. "That's true. I had no framework for it," he said. "Everything I knew about wanting something involved knowing what I'd give up for it. With you, I couldn't find the ceiling. There wasn't one." She came around the table and put her hands on either side of his face, the way he had done on their wedding day, and looked at him directly in the way that was the most Pauline thing about her, the way that saw through to the truth of things without being unkind about it. "There isn't one on my end either," she said, "in case you wondered." "I don't wonder any more," he said, and kissed her in the quiet of the kitchen with the children napping and the July evening coming in through the open door, and the cottonwood trees along the creek gold-lit and whispering in the warm wind, and the land his father had failed on and his own hands had built into something real, and her father's faith planted into the Texas soil and growing, and all of it together. The water and the land and the years of work, and the love that had arrived without a plan or a price, and been worth more than everything else put together. In the years that followed, Redrock grew and the cattle market changed, and the railroad brought new people and new problems and new opportunities, as it always does, and Seth and Pauline navigated all of it together with the complementary intelligence of two people who are stronger combined than they were alone and know it. The ranch grew modestly, not rapaciously, because neither of them was interested in owning more than they could manage well. The operations remained intertwined, the Shelton Creek land and the Graves pastures working as a single unit, the water running as it had always run, silver bright and reliable, the cottonwoods marking the boundary where two properties had once been in dispute and were now simply two parts of a single whole. Rodrigo and Seth worked the cattle side by side as they had always done, and Maria and Pauline ran the household operations and the market garden and a growing friendship that was its own kind of foundation. Estella Vega grew into a bright and determined young woman who went east to a teaching college in the early 1880s and came back to Redrock as its first school teacher, and young Thomas Graves was among her first students, which Thomas considered an unfair advantage and Estella considered entirely fair. Thomas at school was Seth in miniature quiet, thorough, capable of sitting in absolute stillness, while every other child in the classroom fidgeted and wandered. He had his father's mind for detail and his mother's directness, and at 7 years old he had already demonstrated, through a series of carefully conducted negotiations involving extra supper portions and Saturday town trips, that the talent was going to be a real one. Pauline, watching him explain to his father why it would be mutually beneficial for Thomas to stay up an extra half hour on school nights, because he read faster in the dark, and watching Seth listen to this with a very carefully maintained expression, felt a love so sharp and sweet it almost hurt. Rose, at 3 and then 4, was entirely her own creature, social in the way her parents were not, arriving at any new situation with an open friendliness that won people over before they had time to be reserved, and combining this warmth with a stubbornness that her parents recognized as a family trait and found simultaneously charming and exhausting. She loved the cattle, the garden, the horses, and the books, particularly from the age of about 2.5, the Jane Austen, which she could not yet read but which she carried around with great authority, announcing to anyone who asked that it was Mama's best book and that she was taking care of it. And then in the spring of 1882, when Thomas was 6 and Rose was 3, and the Graves Ranch was entering its most productive period yet, Pauline told Seth she was expecting a third child, and this time she told him at the creek's edge in the evening light, standing where she had stood years before with her boots off and her feet in the water, the place where he had first ridden past and not quite turned away. He stood beside her, both of them looking at the water and the cottonwoods turning green again in the April air, and he took her hand in the way he had learned in a cold Texas night on a cattle drive in October 1874, fully, certainly, with no calculation about it. "Thomas and Rose will be pleased," she said. "Thomas will immediately begin negotiating for rights over the new baby," Seth said. She laughed. "Rose will simply assume the baby is hers." "They are very much our children," he said, with something in his voice that was not quite laughter but lived in the same country. She leaned against his shoulder, looking at the creek. The water caught the last of the evening sun and scattered it in pieces across the stones, and the cottonwoods whispered above them, and somewhere in the north pasture, the cattle moved with the heavy, settled sound of animals at peace. The same land that had been disputed and fought over and bargained for and wept over was now simply home, root deep and real, smelling of cedar and creek water and the kitchen garden and the horses in the barn, and the lamp that was already burning in the ranch house window for when they came in. "I am glad my father bought this land," Pauline said. "I am glad you came to collect it," Seth said. She turned to look at him, and he was looking back at her with those deep gray eyes that she knew now held everything he was, the boy who had inherited debt and made it into land, the man who had sat in silence across every negotiating table in the county and never lost, and the husband who had walked into a registry office one April morning to defend a water rights claim and found, sitting across the narrow table with a leather satchel and a land deed, and the most direct green eyes he had ever seen. The one thing in the world he could not outwait, outmaneuver, or outnegotiate, and had in the only smart move left to him chosen not to try. She offered him something he had no price for, and he had the sense to receive it with both hands. Their third child, another son, was born in December of 1882, and they named him James, after no ancestor in particular, but because the name was plain and strong and sounded like someone who would work hard and mean it, and because by the time they had 3 children, Seth and Pauline had learned that the right name for a person is not always the one that comes from somewhere. Sometimes it is simply the one that fits. James Graves came into the world quiet, which was a change from his older siblings, and spent his first year observing everything with the calm, absorptive attention of someone who is taking it all in before deciding what to say about it. Seth recognized this quality immediately and found it, privately, the most relatable thing he had ever seen in a very small child. By Christmas of 1882, the ranch house was full of the specific, irreproducible noise and warmth of a family at its best. The smells of the fire and the food, and the particular smell of small children and horses and good work. The voices of Thomas and Rose competing for the story of their day. Seth's low voice reading from the history of the Texas frontier to whoever would listen after supper. Pauline moving through the kitchen with the capable ease of a woman who has built something from almost nothing and knows its value. James Graves asleep on his father's chest with the trusting weight of a baby who has already determined that the world is safe. Outside, the creek ran through the winter dark as it had always run, the cottonwoods bare and silver-trunked and patient, the Texas stars enormous above the Llano Estacado, the land that Thomas Shelton had bought on faith, and Pauline Shelton had come west to claim and Seth Graves had built his bones into, and that was now, in the most complete and satisfying possible sense, theirs, not in the legal language of deeds and easements, though those existed, clearly worded and correctly filed, but in the language of years and sweat, and the spring and fall, and the children growing in the rooms inside, and the way a place becomes a person when a person loves it long enough and works it honestly. Enough and lets, when the time comes, the right kind of company in. The hardest bargainer in the county had, as it turned out, been waiting all along for someone who would sit across the table from him and offer him something that no price could touch, not land, not water rights, not a seasonal easement carefully worded. Something simpler and more durable than anything that could be negotiated or contracted or claimed. Something that did not require silence to win because it was not a contest. Something that had been moving toward him on a stagecoach from Missouri with $80 in a leather satchel and green eyes and a list of priorities, and had arrived in Redrock, Texas on a Tuesday in April of 1874, and had known, in the way that certain things are simply known, exactly what it had come to find.